Blender tutorial is going to show you how to model, texture, and render this kind of bamboo so that you can go on to make even better scenes like this. Okay, so let's get started by setting up our scene. First we're going to change to the Cycles render up here at the top. We won't be using the Blender internal render engine. We're going to be using Cycles. I don't need the default cube, so I'm going to X delete that. I don't need the default point lamp, so I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to add a sun in here for now, in case we want to do some test renders later. I'm going to go to overhead view with 7, turn on ortho mode with numeric pad 5, and then I've got a leaf texture I'm going to bring in that we're going to trace. So I'm going to use N to bring up the side menu, enable background images, add image, open, let's see, find bamboo leaf.png. Now it's obviously a lot larger than we actually need it to be, so I'm going to bring the size down to about 1. And now I'm going to add a plane. So Shift A, Mesh Plane. I'm going to go into wireframe mode to make this a little easier to see. SY to scale against the Y-axis, SX to do the same against the X-axis, and basically approximately box in the size of the leaf here. Now you'll notice at the bottom I am chopping off a little bit of the texture. That's okay because in a little bit I'm going to extend a bit of this mesh and use this portion of the texture at the bottom to provide the color and texture I want for a long stem, like a leaf stem I guess you could say. Okay, so let me go into edit mode, W to subdivide, again, and 3 times I'm subdividing. So now it's just a matter of scaling this to fit. So Shift Alt right click to select an entire edge, scale X, and basically I'm going to work my way down and approximate the shape of this leaf. So I'm using the Shift Alt right click, SX to scale along X, and then if I need to, GX to position it left and right. Now you'll notice I'm not bringing the mesh right up against the texture. The reason for that is this PNG has alpha data, transparency data associated with it, and we're going to take advantage of that later when we apply this texture to the mesh. So in fact, when it ends up getting rendered, you'll see just the edge of the texture here. You won't actually see the edge of the mesh. Okay, now here I mentioned earlier I'm going to extrude along Y-axis and add a little stub that will extend later to make a longer stem. For now, that is what we need. So now we're going to use the UV image editor to map this image onto this mesh. So I'm going to split this area. In this right pane I'm going to bring up UV image editor. Go to Image, Open, use that same bamboo leaf. Over here, I want to make sure I'm in top view mode with 7, and make sure I'm in ortho mode. Tab into Edit, A to select all vertices. Now I'm going to use U to unwrap this, but what I want to do is use Project from View using bounds. And now I've got a pretty close shape that I should be able to just scale in and probably tweak a little to get this texture image mapped to our mesh. Scale X just a little bit. Okay, this is working out well. Now you notice down here at the bottom, I actually do want to map into the texture towards the bottom here. Okay, so why do I want to do this? The reason is when I'm out at this portion of the leaf, which is likely to be the most visible, as I said earlier, we'll take advantage of the alpha transparency of the PNG. You won't see this part of the mesh, rather you'll just see this edge of the texture. As we get down to here, I actually want these colors to go all the way to the very edge of the mesh, because I'm going to use the shape of this mesh to build some leaf stems, and I need that color to go all the way to the edge of the stem. I think that'll become more clear later in the tutorial, but for now just know that it's okay to be away from the edge here, but that I do want the mapping to go all the way to the edge of the mesh when we get down into this area. The other thing I'll point out is I have found that it works better if there's a very shallow angle as you come into the into this texture. If you have a real sharp angle, for example, if I were to do something like this, where this was a real sharp angle difference between the texture and the mesh, you'll get some weird artifacts and little dips at the edge of your leaf, which would not look attractive. So Control Z to put that back. And I'm going to tab now back out into object mode. Okay, so we're done with the UV editor at this point, so I'm going to join this area over. I'm also done with using the background image for a while, so I'm going to turn that off. Now we're going to use the node editor and actually apply a new material to this mesh object right here. Now, in order to help you see what the node editor does to the material on the object as we drop in the different nodes, I'm going to turn on the rendered viewport shading. If you haven't used this before, it's a nice feature of Cycles in that you can actually turn on in-editor rendering while you're working. I use the default 10 samples, so every time you move it, it recalculates and basically re-renders this view up to 10 cycles. You can change that if your computer's a lot faster, but it gives you at least a quick preview of what this looks like. So in this bottom window, let me go into the node editor, and I'm going to add a new material. Now, if you've not used the node editor before, just follow along. It's not that difficult. If you're an expert in Cycles and using the node editor, well, you'll have to just suffer through this amateur's version of using it. So we're going to Shift A and add our texture. Again, this is an image texture, so I'm going to drop this over here. And this image texture we want to use is, of course, our good old handy dandy bamboo leaf.png. So I'm going to connect this over to here. Alright, so now you'll notice a few things. One, we've got the UV image mapped, or the image has been mapped over thanks to the editor. You'll also notice it doesn't look too great there. I've been talking about that alpha channel, and it looks kind of crummy like that. That's because we're not using the alpha channel yet. So now what we want to do is add a transparency shader, and in order to incorporate it, I need to add a mix shader. You'll notice as I drop this on the line, it'll automatically connect in between these other nodes. I know I want this transparency shader to go into the top input here, and now you'll see I can use factor to adjust how much that transparency shader acts on the image that's coming through here. Now, this is probably not the effect you're expecting. That's because we don't want to just set a pure factor here. We want to leverage the alpha coming off this PNG and let that set the overall factor and masking. And now you'll see that we're taking advantage of the transparency. Okay, yeah, very, very exciting. I know it's been a big build-up, and you're probably thrilled at this point. So, while we're here, there's one other thing I want to add, which is a glossy shader. So I'm going to Shift A, go into Shaders, and add a glossy shader. One of the things I've noticed about bamboo leaves, and a lot of leaves for that matter, is they tend to have kind of a waxy film. They're not totally a matte finish. They gloss, they reflect a little bit of light. So in order to incorporate this glossy shader, I need to add another mix shader. I'm going to put this down here just on the color and the image channel coming through. I'm going to bring this up like this. And now with this factor, I'm going to dial this down a little bit to 3. I'm going to leave the roughness at 2, I think. And now you can see it's added a little bit of gloss to it. Now, at this point, it obviously does not look good because we're dealing with an absolutely flat mesh. But it'll look better later when we curl this mesh and when we add a displacement modifier to give the mesh a little more randomness to the shape. But for now, I just want to demonstrate that we've got the material set up. So again, we start with the diffuse and the diffuse and material output are the first things it'll add by default, and then we added in the image texture, we added in the transparency shader, we use the mix shader to incorporate that, we use the alpha channel from the image to set the factor of that transparency shading, and then for nice effect I added a glossy shader, and again we had to use another mix shader to incorporate it. I dialed the factor down a little bit to 0.3. We may adjust that later as you set up for your final scene, and I just left the roughness at 0.2. That seemed to work for my results when it came to the bamboo that I was looking at. So we have our basic leaf shape, we have the material set up. Let's get into some modeling and make this leaf look a little more interesting. I'm pretty much done with the node editor for now. I do want to split this area again because I'm going to be using 2 of these viewports at once. And this side I want to set up to be looking basically head-on. So I'm using number pad 1. And over here I'm going to return to solid view on this. So we want to add a subsurf modifier. Shortcut for that is I've noticed I have right-clicked on the mesh here. So I'm going to do a Control 2 to add that modifier. And now I'm going to go into edit mode, A to deselect everything, Shift Alt, I want to right click this edge, right click that edge, and O to turn on proportional editing. You'll notice there's a new menu option down here. I want the proportional editing fall off set to sharp, because now when I grab these vertices, I'm going to hit G and Z to lock to the Z axis. You'll notice not only are the vertices I've grabbed moving, but also other vertices near them. That's thanks to the proportional editing tool that I have activated. If I use my mouse wheel, I can reduce or limit the amount of influence that those selected vertices exert on those around them, or I can dial it up and they can cast their strength pretty far, like a Jedi, I guess. Jedi vertices. Okay, this tutorial's starting to fall apart. Let's curl this up just a little bit. Trying to get a soft curve all the way across the mesh, really soft. Okay, that's good. Now, when I've looked at these leaves, what I've noticed is they're actually relatively flat out here. From about here to the tip, they're relatively flat. Now they may curve and bend down, but the overall leaf from side to side is relatively flat. As you get closer to the stem, it gets more and more curved and more concave, and this kind of becomes the stem. So what we want to do here is select a portion of the vertices on the side. I'm going to grab Z and bring that up just a little bit more. And then I'm going to deselect these, and basically we're going to walk our way down to the stem here, having given more and more curl as we go along. So grab Z, bring that up a little more, deselect these, grab Z, same thing again, and then that's about where I think I want it. Yeah, so now you can kind of see what I mean. It's relatively flat through here, and then it gets increasingly curved as you get down to this stem. Now let me re-enable the rendered viewport shading and show you what I mean by, or let me show you why we set up this texture down here earlier. Let me go in here, I'm in edit mode, Shift-Alt-Right click, oops, Shift-Alt-Right click, there we go. I'm going to go 7. Now if I grab this and lock to Y-axis with Y, and I stretch this out, that's basically what I wanted. This will become the base, kind of the basic leaf shape that we'll use to construct our leaf clusters. It's gonna, the stem will basically be pointed up along the kind of the base of the leaf shaft, little cluster of leaves, and then the leaf itself is going to fan out. Now it still looks not that great with that glossy shader. It still doesn't, I mean, looks like it's like a plastic spoon or something. So what we want to do now is add some wrinkles to this shape, and we're going to use a displacement modifier to do that. I'm going to join this area to hopefully make this a little easier to see. So the first thing I want to do, I don't have anything selected, is I'm going to add an empty. You'll see why in just a minute. We're actually going to use this empty to help control or introduce some randomness to the wrinkles on our leaf. So let's see, this is add empty. I'm going to grab X and just move it over a few Blender units so it's out of the way. Now with the mesh selected here, I want to come over to my modifiers under the little wrench. Obviously we have the subsurf modifier we added earlier. I want to add a displacement modifier under the deform list. Okay, so that's pretty displaced. I need a new texture, which is really going to make it look fantastic. The texture coordinates, though, this is where we're going to use an object, and the object we want to use should already be on here, is the empty we created just a moment ago. Now the strength obviously is too high at this point. I'm going to dial this down. I'm going to dial it down to about 0.200. This is a little exaggerated, but I want to do this so you can see why I'm using this empty over here. So now if I grab this mesh, you'll see the displacement kind of, it randomizes as I move it around. Now, even if I duplicate it, I'm going to use a Shift-D, and I'm going to create a new and separate mesh. Now as I move it to different places, it's going to incorporate that displacement modifier, and even though it's a copy of an original, the little wrinkles that'll be on this leaf are going to be unique and different from this. I'm going to use X to delete that. What I think is nice is even if I do an Alt-D, which takes up less memory, and as long as these leaves have the same mesh, base mesh geometry, that displacement modifier still gives me some randomness, so no two leaves will look identical. So going back to this, the strength I ended up using was about 0.05, which granted is very subtle at this stage in the game, but when it renders, it'll provide, in fact, let me go ahead and enable smooth shading and turn back on the rendered view so you can start to get a sense of how that displacement modifier affects the way the light's going to bounce off the leaf. Now this does not add the wrinkles like where the leaf is going to curl out and have maybe, the tip goes up. We'll do that later. This is just a real basic surface randomness, so that when the light hits it, it doesn't look like, a green plastic spoon. So we're done with the leaf for now. I'm going to select the leaf, its corresponding empty, M to move that off to another layer. You don't have to do that. I just like using these different layers to keep my workspace clean. Where now we can start modeling the, what I've been calling it, the leaf shoot. So I'm going to add a circle, reduce the vertices down to 18, scale it down to 0.1, RY90, enter, and then number pad 1. Basically what we want to do here, you're not going to see much of this. It's mostly going to be covered up by the leaves we add, except for down at the base. But if this blue z-axis were to represent the bamboo shoot, this would be the little growth that comes off to the side that curves up and then has the leaves coming off of it. So actually, let me turn off proportional editing with hitting O, extrude out, extrude and rotate a little bit. You want to have a little bit of unevenness here. This is nature. So rotate, extrude, and just something kind of like this. This is probably a little longer than you'll actually see. This will actually end up probably going into the bamboo shoot a little bit. So about right here is what you're actually going to end up seeing. So it comes out and curves up. Move that down. Let me do one more. And just to make sure these are level, I'll put this off level so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to scale along Z and hit 0, and that'll kind of level it out. So that now, when I need to have those selected. So Shift Alt right click. Now when I extrude that up along the z-axis, like that, scale to taper that in. That's about what I want. Now notice when I look real close at this part of the plant, this is actually the kind of the beginnings of a new leaf that's going to eventually curl open and add to the leaf cluster. And if you look real close on an actual bamboo leaf, you'll see that it's tapered, kind of a little bit open at the end here. So that's what I'm going to try to accomplish, like that, almost like a needle opening. Now when I rotated that, you can see I kind of made a mess. That's not what we want in terms of the overall shape. So let me go directly into overhead and scale those along the y-axis to kind of clean that up a little bit. There we go. And that's a little closer to, that's a little closer to what we want. Before I forget, I'm going to turn on the smooth shading. And where'd you go? Sorry, this is getting a little disorienting, probably. Okay, there. That's what we want. In order to make sure that this leaf stem looks like it's part of the same plant and part of the same cluster of growth that's producing the leaves, we're going to texture this with a bit of that bamboo leaf we used earlier. So let me bring back up the UV image editor. Image, open image, go back into my textures folder and get that bamboo leaf. Okay. Now, we're not going to try to map this entire leaf detail around this. Rather, I just want to grab a little bit of this green color here and some of this kind of a striping effect that it has, some of these different shades of green, and just slam it onto this tube real quick. Again, we're not going to see much of this tube, but I do want the colors to match. So let me go into edit mode, Shift Alt, right click, and select that edge there. I'm going to bring up with spacebar the search menu and look for Mark Seam. And now we've got that seamed mark such that when we unwrap this, that'll be the point at which it kind of tears the mesh open to unwrap it. So I hit U, unwrap, and I've got this over here, so R90, enter, grab it, move it up, scale along the X. And basically I want to get kind of these darker greens, and I'm kind of keeping it stretched out some so that I get more variety of detail, a little better resolution of detail. So yeah, kind of that area right in there is what I want. Now, some are probably saying, well, wait a second, this is not a tileable texture. That means you'll be able to tell at this seam where this edge and this edge of the texture don't match. And you're right, but again, much of this shaft up here is going to be covered up with our leaf meshes that we made earlier. This is coming right out of the bamboo stalk, so it's unlikely you're going to see much of this area directly anyways. We do need to create a material to map all of this together. So back down here again in my node editor, I'm going to add a new material. I have just this piece selected here, so I want to add texture, image texture, connect that up. Here again, let me put this window up here, or this viewport, into rendered mode so you can see what this looks like as we go along. Obviously I need to open the file, open image. I went down here to this image texture node to click the open button to get that file. Now you can see it's applied on there. I do want to add a glossy shader. Let me do that, and in order to incorporate that glossy shader I need a mix shader. Put this right here, bring the glossy shader in, and now we've got the gloss. Obviously it's a little too much. I'm going to dial that down to about 0.2, bring up the roughness a little bit, maybe to 0.4. These parts of the plan are actually pretty smooth and fairly shiny. So one other thing I'm going to do here is, in this glossy shader you can adjust the color of the reflection. I'm going to punch this over into the green just a little, and maybe take the edge off of that just a little bit. So there we are. This is just a preview render, so this won't be exactly what it looks like, but gives you a rough idea of what we're trying to accomplish here. Now we're almost ready to build our leaf cluster. I'm going to give myself a little more working room here. Join these areas. I'm going to turn off the rendered view for now and double check the scale of this. Now I'll tell you, actually this is a little taller than I had intended. So I'm going to bring this down probably to about there. And then I'm going to scale the whole thing by 0.5 and move this over to my backup layer. Come over here to my backup layer. Again, this is just my own kind of personal habit I've developed. I like when I get a mesh about the way I want it, I'll put it over here on one of these lower layers and then actually duplicate it and work on a duplicate copy up here in my main workspace. That way if I screw something up, I can just delete it, come back here and grab another point-in-time copy without having to reload the entire blend file. Let's see, this leaf, one thing I should have done earlier was adjust the origin of the object. So I've just gone into edit mode, grabbed all the vertices, and I've slid them over, put the origin about here. That way later, when we go to rotate, I can be rotating from the base of the leaf. It'll just be easier. Obviously that's a much larger leaf than we need. I'm going to bring that down. There, it's probably still a little big, but that's fine. We'll resize the duplicate copy we're going to work with. So while we're here, let me Shift D these guys, M to move them over to my regular work layer. And now we're going to start building up this leaf cluster. One of the first things I'm going to do is just double check some of the texturing on these to make sure that RX90, make sure it looks the way I want before I start duplicating this leaf even more. One thing I've noticed on the bamboo that I have, this new growth that comes up through the middle of the stem typically is not, or rather is about equal in height to where the leaf curves off to. So I can make that a little simpler. If I show you from this perspective, I'm going to tab into edit mode. So what that means is I probably want the leaf bend to start about here. A little bit of a bend there, and then kind of open up almost even with this this new leaf growth that's we're suggesting is coming in. Now you'll notice all I'm doing here for this 3D cursor is just using it as a visual marker for me to rotate around. It's not really serving any purpose inside of Blender at this point. In fact, it's a little, maybe I need to go look this up, but I thought I could do Shift Alt Control C and set my rotation origin to the 3D cursor, but apparently I can't do that in edit mode. Maybe somebody can post a comment and let me know what I'm overlooking here, because I'd like to be able to rotate around that point. There we go. And I'll just give the tip of the leaf here a little more flare up. There. Now down here towards the base, one thing I will do is rotate it out just a hair, and I can probably afford to scale in the base vertices just a little. And I'll double check this in solid mode just to make sure I don't have any, like the base of it's not jabbed out the other side or something like that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now I said I wanted to double check the texturing at this point, now that I've got some curves in the leaf. Now it still looks pretty shiny there. I think quite a bit smoother than, at least than I want. So let me dial down this. I've selected this leaf here. I'm looking at this mix shader that's bringing in the gloss with the image. I'm going to dial down the factor just a tad to soften that up. I'm going to, let me make this a little bigger. I'm going to bring up the roughness just a tad. In fact, let me change the color. I'm going to punch this over into the green just a little bit. Still a little too smooth for my taste. So with this object still selected, I'm going to look in the under the wrench in the modifiers section, the displacement modifier that we set up earlier. I'm going to dial the strength up a little bit. Again, you'll remember this is parented to that empty. The strength interpretation is what will drive kind of the amount of displacement, the amount of wrinkles. Maybe put it at about 0.2. Yeah, I think for my needs, this will work just fine. The leaves of my bamboo are not the centerpiece. I'm going to be, the way I set up the shot, I'm kind of far away, so that should be good. Now it's basically a matter of taking the leaf, let me go back over here to a solid view, and using a Shift D to duplicate this leaf. And then basically use this same leaf and Shift D, and you can scale it down a little. What I like to do is come in here. Again, we're using Shift D because we want to change some of the geometry. So for example, if I go into wireframe, there's my B-select tool. I can grab these, rotate them around some, grab that, rotate it, and create a slightly different looking leaf. And then just ensure that it is in the right position along this stem. Like that. Scale it down just a little bit. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the positioning and reshaping of every leaf. We're gonna skip over that. I mean, so you don't have to watch it. But in short, Shift D to duplicate, and then gradually scale the leaves down as you kind of go down the side. Use your reference material to get a sense of how many leaves and how much they're spread out. Be sure to go in and change the geometry on some of these. And know that another trick is you don't have to change the geometry of every single leaf. For example, if I were to Shift D this, put it over on this other side of the stem, scale it way down, put it way down, let's see, S to scale, maybe fatten it up just a little bit, make sure it's out like this. Now technically it's still a different model, because I did the Shift D, but it's unlikely folks are going to correlate that those two are actually the same, same leaf shapes. You can save a little time with that. So continue to Shift D, populate the leaves around, flip over to solid mode on a regular basis, and look for, situations like this where you might want to kind of straighten it out. Watch out for situations where the leaves intersect. You would not normally want. See, I'm going to create a situation here. Just as an example, you would not want. There you go. Well, watch out for situations like this where one leaf kind of cuts through another. The bamboo leaves. The good thing with bamboo, at least the bamboo that I'm using as reference material, the leaves aren't real tightly packed. They're not real close. So yeah, so take a few minutes, Shift D, move the leaves around, and then we'll keep going. Now that we have this leaf cluster finished up, basically want to go around and look at all the points where the leaves intersect kind of that stem. Double check the leaves themselves, make sure they're not bisecting each other or being cut by either the stem or another leaf. I don't see anything there. And then from a side view, I basically want to see that from all directions it has a fairly interesting profile, that I didn't accidentally line up all the leaves on the same axis and have a profile where it just looks like a stick. So there are some leaves sticking out in all directions. Alright. Now we will B-select, highlight all these, right-click on the stem last, and a Control-P to parent the leaves down to the stem. That way, obviously, we can grab the stem and the leaves will follow. And with that in place, I'll now make sure everything's highlighted, move it to my background layer, my workspace layer here. Put this over here. I want to make another duplicate of this. Again, I'm Shift-D'ing this time because I'm going to change some of the geometry. And now the geometry's changed. Actually, Blender doesn't have a hotkey for randomize a bamboo leaf cluster, but through the magic of post-editing, you didn't have to watch me duplicate this and change a bunch of geometry. Basically what I did was did a Shift-D of this, took this one, moved it to my other workspace, and basically went around and kind of tweaked and adjusted these leaves, moved them around, changed their geometry a little bit, just enough to randomize it. So a couple of them are probably still identical, but they've been moved around and shouldn't be noticed. Let's get things set up to do the actual bamboo stalk. Shift space, come back out of full screen mode, and actually we kind of have everything about where we want it. So again, these are my backups, a couple of building blocks we're going to be using shortly. I've got all this on this, what I call kind of my backup layer, my work layer, and then I've got my main workspace here. Give ourselves a little more room. There. So, some of you may be just joining the tutorial at this point in order to learn how to do just the bamboo stalk itself. You may not be interested in the leaves, and you've skipped ahead. A couple things to note. At this point, we're using the Cycles renderer. I've deleted the default lamp. We're using a sun light source here just to do test rendering. And I think that's about it. We've got over here some leaf building blocks that we built earlier, but you may not be interested in those. So, for everyone else, we'll resume and let's build the actual bamboo stalks. So the first thing I'm going to do is Shift S and move my cursor to center so I can Shift A and add a circle mesh. The number of vertices, really I'm just going to dial it down to 16. I don't need that high of a resolution. I'm going to scale to 0.25, so that's S.25 enter. And then I'm going to tab into edit mode, E to extrude, Z axis by 2 Blender units, enter. Now if we go into our front view here, I'm going to do a few more extrusions before we unwrap this thing. So up here at the top, I'm going to EZ up about 4 times. Oops, what happened there? EZ, there we go, EZ, and EZ. And what these rings are going to do is later, let's see, Shift Alt, don't do this now because we still want to texture this before we do too much with this geometry. But later I'm going to pull these out, and that provides kind of that little ring between the different bamboo segments. And this additional ring down here will help insulate the lower geometry when we go to tilt this ring up here. So later we're going to be pulling these out and then tilting it a little bit. But again, don't do that yet because we want to unwrap this and get the texture mapped over to it before we start torquing the mesh around too much. Let's see, down here at the bottom, I want to add another extrusion along the Z-axis just a little bit. Again, notice I haven't scaled anything. And then here in the middle, I'm going to do a Control R, use my mouse wheel to add a few more rings. I'll left click once to set the number, and then I'm going to bring these down a little bit, because later what we'll do is we'll kind of pull this in. I'm exaggerating it here, but we'll pull this in to give the bamboo segment a little bit of curve, a little bit of shape. Control Z. Okay, so that's about what I want. I've got 4 segments of rings up here at the top. I've got 4 down here, again kind of favoring the bottom of this segment, and then I've got an extra extrusion and an extra ring down here. Now let's get this thing unwrapped so we can put a new UV texture on it. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, Shift Alt or right click to select that edge back there. Spacebar, mark seam. You can tell it's added that red line. That's the point at which the unwrapper will basically rip this mesh, unroll it, and project it on the UV image editor. So let me bring up that UV image editor by splitting this area. UV image editor, image, open image, move to my textures folder and get this bamboo stem.png. This is a texture that I made earlier based on some pictures that I'd taken. Come over here, I'm still in edit mode, select A to get all the vertices, U to bring up the UV mapping menu, just a regular unwrap. Then over in this window, I will scale X. Whoops. Use the shift bar to slow that down, or yeah, shift key to slow that down a little. Grab X. Now this texture is intended to wrap seamlessly along this horizontal axis here. And because it's going to be wrapping, I want to make sure that I'm completely or just barely inside the texture. Because if we're over, obviously we're going to have like a little black seam that we're not going to want. Pull that there. And how are we doing on this side? Okay, we're completely in. Now the top up here, this is that little bamboo ring. I need to take these right here and scale this down along the y-axis. Grab Y, because this needs to these three rings up here at the top need to draw all of their color and texture from this kind of this brown, light brown ring. So I've still got them selected. Scale Y, grab Y. There we go. And then Shift Alt right click on this guy, this ring, grab Y, bring this up to about there. Alright, so now let's get this thing a texture so we can see what it looks like. So with this object still selected, I'm down here, I'm still in the node editor. I'm going to add a new material. Shift A, texture, image texture. Like I've done before, let me put this up in rendered view. And while I'm here, I'm going to come over to the world buttons and bring the world color up just a little bit. Make it a little easier to see. Okay, connect in, color this image texture into this node. Obviously we need to then open, get our bamboo stem.png, and there it is. Something else we're going to add while we're here is a glossy shader. So Shift A, shaders, glossy. I drop that here. And then I need a mix shader so that I can incorporate that glossy shader. I'm going to dial down the factor on the mix shader to about 0.2. Bring the roughness up to 0.4. We may change that later. I'll also give a little bit of green tint. There we go. Now we want to adjust the model of this bamboo segment here to make it look a little more like actual bamboo. I'm going to join these areas to give myself a little more room. Come over here into solid view. Before I forget, I want to turn on smooth shading. And then I'm going to do a Control 2 to add a subsurf modifier. And if I come over here to the little wrench and check out the settings of this modifier, I'm going to dial up the subdivisions to 3. 1 to go into front view mode. I want to switch over to wireframe, tab into edit, A to deselect everything, my B select tool to grab those rings, and then S to scale this in some. There we go. Now if we look at the rendered view, kind of tell we've got that kind of hourglass shape. And in fact, let me come back in here and give these rings just a little more scaling in. Alright. Now you've noticed by now, I'm sure, we talked about this earlier, I think, that that brown ring band is a lot thicker than I actually want. So, come back into edit mode. I want to grab these rings. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say grab, I should say highlight. I want to select these rings and then SZ to scale along the Z axis and tighten those up just a little bit. Now thanks to the UV image tool that we used earlier, that texture that we've applied should follow and align to the rings just like that. Let me go back into wireframe mode, tab back into edit. Now with these two rings selected right here, I'm going to S to scale, pull that out a little, and we get that kind of characteristic classic bamboo ring around the edge there. Now the next thing I want to do is take these upper four rings, select those, and R to rotate a little bit. The bamboo I have, these little rings are offset, or not offset, I guess they're rotated a little bit. So I want to do that. The ring we added earlier, or the ring that we have here, this, let me highlight it, Shift-Alt right-click. I'm not going to change it, but just highlighting it to show. That ring is basically providing us a little bit of an insulation, so that as we adjust the geometry up here, we're not torquing or twisting the rest of the bamboo shaft down there. So if you find yourself perhaps accidentally, or if you don't have that ring and you're trying to do this rotate and you're kind of wiggling the whole shaft around, that didn't sound good, you'll want to add a ring there. And if you need to do that, again, it's Control R, and you can add that ring if you need to. I'm using the mouse wheel to increase or reduce the number of rings. Escape, I don't need that ring. Tab back out, and that's what we have at this point. Now we want to Alt-D duplicate this and probably make some tweaks to the bottom of the geometry. So Alt-D, Z, bring it up here. A reminder, the Alt-D is a logical or pointer copy, so any changes we make to this mesh up here will be reflected in the other mesh. The change I'm most likely going to be interested in is bringing in this bottom ring just a little bit. And I'm going to bring in this ring just a hair. So now, if later we duplicate this and we end up, if you end up accidentally sticking it down in real low like that, you won't have an issue with the mesh projecting or popping out the side. So we want it about there. Now if I go to solid view, you're going to see we have a little bit of a gap there. So something else we need to do, is I've selected the lower one now. I'm going to go into wireframe on this, tab into edit mode, Shift-Alt right-click to grab that ring, scale it in a little bit there, and then grab X and shift it a little bit there. Just make sure that I don't have any gaps. Now, if we go back out into solid view, should see that there are no gaps, and there are not, so that's good. One other thing, as you Alt-D and start to build this bamboo shaft, bamboo stalk, I've highlighted this top one. I'm going to do an RZ 120 degrees. So 1, 2, 0, enter. Because again, we want to have these little rings going at different angles. Let me Alt-D, Z, bring that up to about there. And then again, I'm going to do an RZ 150. Alt-DZ. What happened? Alt-DZ. There we go. And then RZ 220. Go back to my solid view. You can kind of see we've got those little rings going in different directions. And I'll do one more. Alt-D, Z. Grab Z, bring that down a hair. Yeah. And then I'm going to rotate Z. So RZ 300. Where does that put it? Yeah, sure. Actually, I'll tell you what, since I don't have a top on this, let me RZ and get that facing away from us. Again, it's all about illusions and cheating. And if I flip that back over into rendered mode, you start to get an idea how the texture also rotates around with it. There we go. Let's go back now to solid mode. Actually, wireframe. I'm going to select all these, scale that down. And move that over to my kind of backup layer that I mentioned earlier. And now I have all the building blocks I need. They're not to the same scale. That's no big deal. We're going to be scaling them up and down later. If I put this on rendered, you start to get a rough idea of the building blocks we've got. So before we start duplicating these and slowing down Blender with lots of copies, I'm going to go through on the subsurf modifier and dial down the views to 0. Now this doesn't change anything with the rendering, it simply makes the objects a little simpler in this 3D viewport so that while we're working, Blender itself doesn't get bogged down having to manage all of the mesh details. I'm just going through all the objects, dialing down the view subdivisions to 0. You know, if you've got a faster computer or you don't mind waiting, you can just dial it down a little bit. Doesn't have to be 0. Any reduction helps. But since I'm already beyond the kind of the modeling phase, and now we're basically just arranging and composing the final shot, I don't need this much detail visible. There, I think we hit most of them. Just going to double check some of these. Make sure they're all at 0. Yes, they look a little uglier now, but don't worry, when they render, they'll use the resolution as defined under the render option. Okay, oh, and the bamboos, did I get all those? Yes, I did. Alright. So now I'm going to grab these building blocks. Now at this point I'm doing a Shift-D. I want a full copy of these. So if I choose to modify them at all, I'm not messing up my originals that I have back here on my my backup workspace. So with these duplicated copies, that's a Shift-D, copies highlighted. M to move. Put those over on the first layer again. And now we'll start assembling our little bamboo stalks. So you really don't need that many unique pieces to to make a scene with what looks like a lot of variety. I'm going to show you a few tricks here that I've used. First, I'm going to build up one of these little bamboo stalks. Rotate Z 180. What you can do is by shrinking and moving and rearranging even just a few things, you can get a lot of variety, especially if you have some things out of focus or if you have a limited depth of field. There's a lot you can do. For example, here, obviously having different sizes. So we've started with this leaf cluster is unique from this one. Going to position these about like that. Scale that one down a tad. This one's a little lower down the stalk, so I want it even smaller. And on the bamboo that I have, these tend to sprout out right beneath right beneath these little rings. That's why I'm putting them in that location. And effectively making that one a little shorter. Okay. So how can we add more variety to this? Well, first thing you can do, I'm going to Alt-D, so I'm not going to be making any mesh changes, is simply rotate along the Z-axis 200 degrees. Actually, maybe even a little more than that. About like that. Now you would say, well, that's pretty close, you didn't rotate it that much, and you're right. But as you fill up your scene with these things, depending on what your layout is, you'd be surprised. You'd drop it down a little, give it a little angle, rotate it a different way, and you've got an entirely, well, not entirely new, but you can fool people's eyes into thinking you have an entirely new bamboo stem. The other thing you can do, obviously, would be to just switch these around. Put this one at the top, and stick this one down near the side, change its size a little bit. So that's another thing you can do to add some variety. Something else I've found, I'll just show you a few here. Highlight these and shrink. I hit Y twice. I just shrink along the Y-axis a little. It just changes the shape a little bit. Is it squeezing this stem part right here? Yes, it is. But depending again on how your shot's laid out, unlikely that people are going to notice that. So what I'm going to do now is basically go through and create a variety of these little guys and position them around in front of the camera. Alright, so a lot of Alt-Ds later, I have this scene laid out. I didn't want to make you endure all of the position of this stuff, but basically all I've done is Alt-D this stalk with these two leaf clusters and position, turn, twist, raise, lower. Frankly, I didn't do a lot of scaling, but kind of sprinkled them out here, far away from the camera. This is kind of just some background foliage back here. I also, without the leaves, just Alt-D'd, rotated, twisted, turned, repositioned. Again, kind of move some up, move some down so their little segments would not align too closely, and put those over here to the right of the camera. You know, this shot isn't really a great or beautiful nature shot. It's not a very natural scene. But the intent is, from a tutorial perspective, to show you kind of what this bamboo might look like if you were to cluster it together, like you would see more naturally, maybe in the forest or maybe an interior scene. This over here is just to give some balance to the picture and provide some green in the background. This will be out of focus. We're going to set, I'll show you how to set the depth of field pretty narrow and focus here on this kind of the hero stalk, I guess we can call it. So how do we set that depth of field here? Well, one thing I know you need to do, or I've learned at least online is helpful, is to actually establish the units. So if I go over here to my scene configuration settings, I've selected metric and I've set the scale to 1. Now, I believe what that means is that each of these large squares here is equivalent to about 1 meter. You know, in a lot of 3D modeling, they say that the metrics or the units don't matter. What I've been told, or what I've learned on other tutorials, is that in fact it does matter when it comes to the camera, particularly in this cycles renderer, because the camera is using true camera settings when it comes to some of the lens behaviors and the f-stop behaviors and lighting. I'm told, or I've learned, that you get better results if you establish some standard units. So metric scale of 1 in this case, so that then with the camera highlighted, if we go to the camera properties, we're going to want to use our f-stop aperture. Now I've got this dialed down pretty low. I've got it dialed down to 2. I want it very tight. Let's see, what does it say here? Lower numbers give more defocus, or another way of saying it is that the field of focus is very narrow. So if this is the front of the camera over here, and I'm focusing on this hero stalk, the area that's going to be in focus is going to be pretty narrow. As you move back from the camera, this stuff back here should be pretty blurry. Now, how do we know that it should focus on this hero stalk? Well, I'll show you that. I'm going to select this object just to get its name. You can see in the lower left here it's circle 0.021. Now if I go, remember that, circle 0.21, because this is the object we've chosen to focus on. We come back to the camera, go to the camera properties, and down here under focus we want to select circle 0.06, was it 061? I think it was. F-stop down at 2. We come back here and double check that. 021. Okay, 021. There we go. Now, there's nothing special about this object that I chose. We could have selected this. We could have selected this leaf. Anything along here, that's just setting the distance from the camera lens where we want to focus. If you wanted to focus way back here, you could pick one of these objects, and then these other items in the foreground would be, I think they become out much more blurry. Something else I wanted to adjust in the world settings is the color I'm using. I want to soften this up a little bit and punch this over into the green just a tad. Now again, this is a tutorial scene. I don't have a good background that we're using, but I figured we'd at least try to get the lighting a little green. Well, let's get this thing set up for a final render. Come back over here to my render settings. Let's see, resolution. Let's put that up to 100%. When using the cycles render, if you haven't used this before, one thing you'll want to adjust down here under sampling. And the samples is basically the quality of the render that you're going to get, or how long it spends computing the different paths of all the light beams in the scene. So I had done some test renders around 50. I'm going to bump that up to 100, which is fairly low. I know a lot of people will go up to 500 or 1,000 or something like that. Frankly, given the quality of these models and the quality of my textures and the quality of my modeling, I probably don't want it that high. I'd rather keep the sampling a little lower so it's a little more, a little softer, maybe a little more forgiving on some of my work here. That should do it. So let's go for a render and see how it turns out. And here's the final render. A lot of things that could be done better here. Obviously, this stalk right here I think could be a little thinner, or perhaps even turn on some subsurface modifier to smooth that out some. That kind of jumps out at you. The composition of this shot, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a wreck. This is more of a, again, tutorial setup. The intent being, at least on this side, you get a sense over here on the right what some of this bamboo looks like when you have a lot of it growing clustered together. And then this area back here was basically dropped in to provide something that was defocused and to provide a little background over here. Other than that, I mean, there's no sky, there's nothing else of interest in the scene. There's no ground. It's just a bunch of bamboo floating around, thrown up in the air, I guess, just floating around. So a lot of room for improvement. But look, I hope you go out and you make a better scene than this and share it. Put together a tutorial, give back to the community. It would be great. If you've enjoyed this or if it's been helpful, the biggest thank you would be, either a follow on Twitter at POTUS98, or comment, shoot your work over. Let me see what you guys have done, you guys and girls have done with this stuff. I'd love to see it. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, big thanks and shout out to Andrew Price and his tutorials over at BlenderGuru.com. If you've seen any of those, you can absolutely tell I'm definitely trying to reuse a lot of those techniques. So thanks for using Blender and participating in the community, and have a wonderful day.